Do you see that?
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this special webinar that is being presented in conjunction with the Wyoming Manufacturing Organization. So the Manufacturing Works. Today we're going to be discussing business risks, known and unknown. Can you recognize risk? Can an unrecognized stop you cold? Okay. Firestorm is presenting this today, and this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And the work product that we're presenting must be read in conjunction with your organization's local personal counsel. In addition, please do not interpret the information given and the comments made as legal advice or legal opinion. The presenters today are Guy Higgins. He's a principal with Firestorm. Guy has a career in the U.S. Navy as a naval officer. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy. Excuse me, Guy. And he spent 12 years in senior leadership with the Boeing organization. Jennifer Freedman is also a principal of Firestorm. By the way, both Guy and Jennifer are located in the Denver, Colorado area. And we're pleased to have them working there. Jennifer's background is in marketing, communications, and strategy development, and she's been very successful in dealing with clients and bringing them up to date on disaster readiness and preparedness and crisis communications. From the Manufacturing Works, we hope she's able to get back in. There was a bit of a connection problem. Amanda Hansen. Amanda is the Southeast Wyoming business engineer consultant for the Manufacturing Works, and she's a delight to work with, and I'm sure that you have felt that as well as you deal with her.
Okay.
Amanda is trying to get back in. She just texted me. Isn't technology wonderful?
So, and this is Jennifer. I'll do Amanda's slide since she's not with us. Manufacturing Works works for the manufacturers in Wyoming, helping them with solutions. They want to create value and help manufacturers grow and do better. They have engineering solutions from product design to prototyping, business growth solutions. They work with manufacturers on innovation, value-added sales, exporting, any kind of tools that they can bring to manufacturers that help them generate growth. They're concerned with efficiency, energy, and environmental solutions, helping manufacturers to improve efficiency and use less energy, and also reducing pollution. Business management solutions, your marketing, your branding, your graphics, web design. Amanda, are you back? I saw her back on, but I don't have her yet. And then they're just now starting to work with Firestorm and bringing you business resilience solutions. And that's all about responding to, recovering from natural and man-made disasters, things that can affect your operations or even suspend them entirely. So Amanda, if you're back, I'm sorry, I already briefed your slide for you.
I just got back on. Thank you very much.
If you have anything else to say as we go along, please jump in.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, Bill. This is Guy, and I'd like to welcome everybody who has joined the webinar. One of the things that we like to do as we start these webinars is to just give a quick update. And so talking about what's happening now. So headlines, and some people may see things that they resonate with and some of them won't. I think everybody's aware of the situation that's going on with the Ebola and the severe respiratory illness across the U.S. And that's one of the headlines that's getting a lot of attention today. In addition to that, there have been a couple of incidences of workplace violence. However you want to categorize that, the attacks in the warehouse in Oklahoma City, the police sniper incident in Pennsylvania, those things are percolating up, and they're still looking for the sniper in Pennsylvania. Social media. You hear about this off and on throughout. Just recently, a passenger was prohibited from boarding a JetBlue flight because they had been using social media to comment on the sobriety of the flight crew, which is a little scary. I think everybody has been aware of the issues with hacking into the cloud, as well as attacks on various business and financial institutions. Specifically, the headlines talked about the Home Depot and the Target with tens of thousands of accounts compromised. And of course, there's this continuing civil unrest in St. Louis. So those are the kind of things that are going on in the world today that may or may not be impacting people in the local area or even nationwide.
Or where similar things may be impacting you in the near future.
So I just wanted to lay a little bit of a foundation here. A long time ago, I had the opportunity to listen to one of the internationally recognized business gurus, and he brought an interesting perspective. He said that the purpose of business is to stay in business. And in order to do that, businesses have to make and sell products. The products might be physical, they might be a service, they might be any number of things, but in order to stay in business, you have to make and sell products and earn profits. And if you do that, you stay in business. Now, staying in business is a good thing. It creates jobs, it improves people's lives, it contributes to overall benefits, and so that's a good thing. And we're going to come back to this and talk about it, touch on it a couple times throughout the webinar. However, what I want to do is look at this and say, all right, so to stay in business, we have to have a business strategy. And within Firestorm, I like to talk about two different branches of that. One branch is what we call business as usual. And that's the things that you attending this webinar do routinely. You think about sales, you think about marketing, you think about growth and new products and service and customer service and how you do that. You're planning to succeed. And that's all good stuff, and that's how you stay in business. But there's another part. Oh, are you prepared for that? I suspect everybody is. I strongly suspect everybody is. There's another perspective to this, and that's what we call business as unusual. And that is when something happens that seriously, significantly disrupts your daily operations and providing that customer support, making products, conducting marketing, doing sales, collecting cash. That's a disruption, and that's business as unusual, and we need to be planning to recover from those situations, planning to recover from disaster or crisis or emergency or whatever word you want to apply to that. And the question there is, are you prepared to do that? And that's a really important question, and we'll, like I said, we'll come back and touch on these things. So what are the risks that we have to think about? No one wants to look out the plant window or the storefront or the office window and see this coming across the horizon. That is a serious risk of disruption. So what other risks do we have? So as manufacturers, as business people, you've all probably thought about a fire in your plant or your office building. You've thought about what happens if I lose my information technology capability, my servers, my memory, my information, my computers. What happens if I don't have access to the network? What if I come under network attack? What if I just lose power? You've probably all thought about those things.
And these are the kind of disasters that you've all thought about and you've probably already planned for. I'm sure that all of you have evacuation plans in your plants, in your buildings for fire. You probably most organizations already have IT disaster recovery plans because they know how important it is. And of course, loss of power is something that we think about also. The IT disaster recovery plans are really important, but IT is not the only thing that can go out.
Yep. So the question is, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan to recover from those?
And we think you probably do at this point.
Yep. So in Wyoming, those were things that everybody thinks about. In Wyoming specifically, there are at least one Category 2 or above tornado every year. So that picture we had, I can't tell you it was Wyoming, but I can't tell you it wasn't. Earthquakes, interestingly enough, Wyoming experiences one magnitude 3.5 or greater earthquake every year. Now, that's not like Southern California where I used to live, where they have one of those a week, but it's still 3.5 or greater every year. If you're in the wrong place, can be a problem. Blizzards, every 2 years, Wyoming experiences 3 serious blizzards. Every year, Wyoming sees 3 floods. And I'm going to take a little bit of a pause here, Jennifer, and tell some stories. So a year ago, down here in the Colorado Front Range, just a little over a year ago, we had a 100-year flood. That was this is the 13th month since then. And there are still families and businesses and whole towns that are finally recovering and starting to get back to normal after that 100-year flood. We have a couple of rivers down here that the big debate is, should we try to put those rivers back where they were? So, Bill, you pick up one end of the river, I'll pick up the other, and we'll move it back over that riverbed where it used to be. It's a serious question, because now we're trying to figure out, well, who owns the old riverbed, and what do we do with the people whose land is now the new riverbed? So those are a big deal. When I was in the Navy, I was working with McDonnell Douglas in their factory in St. Charles, Missouri. And that's not too far from the banks of the Mississippi. And they had a 100-year flood. And the factory was built to be above a 100-year flood level. And when the water stopped rising, I could take a string and stretch it 3 feet from the edge of the building to the water. And the next year, they had another 100-year flood. And that one got to within less than 3 feet of the building. So 100-year floods are merely a statistic. It doesn't say about how often you can have them. Winter storms in Wyoming, a little over 7 a year. Strong winds about every 3.5 weeks or so on average. About every 2.5 weeks for severe thunderstorms. And there are 150 wildfires every year in the 10 western states. So Wyoming may not have 10 in a given year, but on average it starts to make up for it. With California, because it's so much bigger, taking up more than their fair share, but that's okay. So, have you planned for the occurrence of these particular things? They are the situation in Wyoming. So do you need to? We're talking about risks this week. We'll talk about some of the ways to answer some of these questions in subsequent webinars too. But now, with those risks of disruption, have you ever thought about...
Uh-oh.
Okay, so we'll live with this. Social media damaging your company.
Sorry.
So, have you ever thought about social media damaging your company? Have you ever thought about communicable illness decimating your workforce? And I don't mean wiping out 10 or 20% of your workforce. It might just be one person, the right person. Have you thought about violence in the workplace? Have you thought about losing a vital supplier because they've had a disruption, because they had a flood? What about the consequences of mishandling a crisis? So when British Petroleum had the problem with the Deepwater Horizon blowout and subsequent oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they became almost a poster child for how to not handle a crisis. They communicated poorly. They were ineffective in having backup plans in place. And so it's important to look at that. Next one.
So in each of these things we're going to talk about now in just a little bit more detail, because these are the things that we want you to realize that you may want to be concerned about. Oh, there's another one.
I knew that.
I'm not doing well.
So you can also have an internal business crisis, and we'll talk, like Jennifer said, we'll talk more about that internal business crisis. So social media risk. Everybody knows that social media is exploding, and it can be used for good or for evil. Jennifer and I have a presentation that we've made. We call it social media, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so it can be used either way. You can have an internal risk, or you can have an external risk. Internal risks, obviously, are how social media is used within your company. External risk is how it might be used outside the company that damages you. And the only way to deal with a social media fire is to use social media water. You have to be expert in using social media if you're going to be subject to the risks of social media. And then social media policies by businesses and by companies are or can be subject to government guidance and regulation. For example, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, has published specific guidance on what company policies can and cannot include in their guidance to employees.
And
So,
going back to the social media fire, you had a story about that, of fighting social media fire with social media water. Okay, you're looking at me blankly. Great. Okay, so Guy was telling me yesterday about a company that got into trouble with had social media attack on them, and rather than responding in social media, rather than having a plan, knowing how they would respond by social media, they put out a press release. And these days, press releases move very slowly. Social media moves at the speed of light. So that's why you need social media water to put out a social media fire.
that's right. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Amy's Baking Company. This is an example of an internal risk in social media. Amy's Baking Company is a small bakery in Arizona, and they were invited to participate on Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares. And they, on one of those reality shows on television, and they got on there, and they were, the two owners were so difficult to work with that Gordon politely and gently invited them not to come back to the show. And they started then, following that, the bakery started getting reviews online, on Yelp, on Reddit, and they responded to them. And they responded to them with social media. So here's one of the ones. I'm not going to read it to you, but punks is probably not a word you want to use in communicating with your customers.
And then they followed up on this reaction.
If punks weren't good enough, they followed up with this reaction, which is another thing you probably don't want to say to your customers online. So these folks took a situation that was not good and proceeded through the dint of a great deal of hard work and strategic planning to make it much, much worse.
Yes.
So this is an example of an internal risk. Now, here's an example of an external risk. On British Airways, there was a man traveling with his father, and British Airways managed to lose the father's luggage. And they did all the things that we would do if we were traveling. They went to the lost luggage and they made a complaint. And British Airways simply couldn't be bothered to deal with it. And it really upset the guy. So he went out and actually paid to have a paid advertisement on Twitter. And this was the paid advertisement. Don't fly British Airways. Their customer service is horrendous. Now, this particular tweet was seen by not 10 people, not 20 people. It was seen by 76,000 people. And they were people who are or flyers, they're travelers. They might or might not have been British Airways customers, but this is not something you want to go out and get to your customers. And British Airways did not become aware of this tweet for over 8 hours. And in social media land, 8 hours is an eternity. So this is an example of an external threat, things that really happen to real people in real times.
So it's important to consider the risks of social media, because there are risks to your reputation and to your brand. And so it's very important to prepare for social media, a social media attack, and know ahead of time how you are going to respond and what you're going to say.
Yep. Okay, communicable illness risk. This happens to be a very complicated area. Not only because there are so many different things, communicable illnesses you have to think about, but because it involves so many different parts of the company. Human relations, pay and cash flow, operations, everything that you do can be touched by communicable illness. And the risk is that a significant portion of your workforce gets sick. What's a significant portion? As Jennifer and I were putting these slides together, we said, the one person can be a significant, if it's the wrong person to get sick, that person can be a significant impact. What if a significant portion or some portion of your workforce elects, even though they are not sick, to stay home because they see a risk of infection, or because they're staying home to take care of people in the family who are ill?
Or even just kept home. There's times when schools, when kids don't even go to school because there's just the threat of a communicable illness, and so the parents will keep their children at home. So it's possible that a lot of your workforce would stay home with their children, whether they're sick or not sick.
And of course, those kinds of things are associated with sick pay, sick days, and some companies allow employees to accumulate sick days. And so if there is a serious outbreak of communicable illness, a company could be hit with a spike in sick pay, number of people out, number of days out, people taking accumulated sick days over time. And so you might need to think about, am I going to have temporary staff? Am I going to have to pay overtime costs? I'm paying for sick leave, I'm paying overtime costs, I'm bringing in temporary staff. It's an unanticipated impact of a communicable illness. These kinds of things need to be thought about, and they need to flow into HR policies so that decisions are made before you get to the point where it's an emergency. Emergency is the wrong time to have to make a decision without prior preparation.
And most companies, as they're planning and they're budgeting, they realize that the workforce, a lot of their workforce does not take all of their sick leave. They'll either accumulate it or they just don't take it. So if all of a sudden you have a pandemic and the entire company takes maximum sick leave, a lot of companies have not planned for that kind of a hit to their budget. So it's something to be thinking about.
Right. And there's also the risk, and this is particularly true for retailers. So when you go down to your local retailers, think about it. But retailers frequently have very restrictive or limited sick days for their sales force. And so people run out of sick time and they come to work even though they may still be contagious. And that just generates additional risk and additional people getting ill, impacting productivity and contributing to this spread of the pandemic or the communicable illness. And then there's also the potential risk associated with the cost of employees being forced to come to work. And when I use force, I'm not talking about somebody twisting their arm. I'm just saying people can feel that compel, Jane, you're really important at this time of the month. That can be perceived as being forced. It can just be somebody's internal perception. I really need to go to work even though I don't feel well, because it's important that I be there and get my job done. And so those kinds of situations can result in any number of different risks, including things like even as far away as workers' comp claims might be filed because someone felt compelled to come to work and got sick because they came to work. So communicable illness is a very complicated area that requires a great deal of thought ahead of time.
Well, and this the forced, and we did put the forced in quotes, as Guy said, so because people aren't actually forced. But it is possible that your HR policies would cause your employees to feel forced to come to work, even when they don't want to, if they're well. And so looking at your HR policies is one of the parts of planning for communicable illness. And it is important to plan for that and to know how you will react and what your HR policies will be in that event.
Yep.
Okay.
So the next slide that we have coming up is
my desktop.
Is workplace violence. Whenever people hear about workplace violence, the first thing that they think about is obviously the active shooter. And certainly that is something that needs to be thought about because the impact is so big. The impact is just huge. And so people pay a lot of attention to it. It gets huge amount of press coverage. But in fact, there are FBI report 160 active shooter incidents between 2000 and 2014. That's just about 11.5 incidents per year over that 14-year span throughout the entire United States. So big impact, low potential, but again, big impact, so it needs to be thought about. But something that's much closer to home is that every year there are 2 million incidents of workplace violence reported. Now, those are only the ones that are reported. There are probably a significant number more that are not reported, and that's the assessment made by the people who compile the statistics in the Department of Labor. Those incidents can include domestic violence spillover, so an irate spouse or significant other shows up and starts creating a ruckus. Doesn't have to be an active shooter, just has to disturb the situation. It can be internal employee-to-employee harassment, whether that's physical or cyber, and that can include bullying. It can be sexually threatening or uncomfortable situations. It can be a hostile workplace. All of these things are included in the way the government compiles and deals with violence statistics in the workplace. And any of those and others can also create a risk to how the employees feel about being at work, their well-being, their morale. It can impact their productivity, and of course it can ultimately affect your brand, your reputation. So it can diminish productivity, and it can make a hit to your brand, to your reputation. And those are important things. So the risk of workplace violence is something that needs to be considered, even if you're not going to think a lot about that active shooter kind of a situation. And there are incidents that help you break out and decide which businesses, which kinds of situations have the highest risk and don't. But once again, it's risk and impact, and we'll talk about impact in a future webinar. So the next thing we're going to talk about is supply chain disruption. In today's increasingly global environment, supply chains are becoming longer and more complicated. And some of you have supply chains, and some or all of you are parts of someone else's supply chain. There are more suppliers in more locations, and those suppliers have supply chains. So you may outsource something, a component, to company A, who then sublets some of that out to company B, who goes to company F, and eventually there's some guy in a garage in Botswana someplace who is doing part of your supply chain. You may not even be aware that that has happened, because as the supply chains propagate downstream, we lose visibility into the suppliers, into the supplier risk, and into their preparedness, their resilience, their ability to recover from their disruptions. And we like to talk about that as that supply chain risk is like inheriting insanity from your kids. You inherit risk from your supply chain. If you fail to deliver to a customer because your supply chain has failed, then the customer is going to come talk to you. They're not going to go talk to your supply chain. So you've inherited that risk from your supply chain, and it's important that you understand where that supply chain risk is and how to help deal with it.
So you can outsource the work, you can outsource the parts, but you cannot outsource the risk.
Right. And it's really interesting. One of our colleagues worked with a major manufacturer on the West Coast, and they went through and did a supply chain risk assessment, and they identified over 200 risks that this major manufacturer was unaware that they had. But by becoming aware of them, they were able to eliminate the vast majority of them without having to rework their supply chain.
Well, and not only that, I mean, don't be overwhelmed by the fact that this particular manufacturer found 200 risks. But what you do when you do a supply chain risk assessment is you determine which of the risks, are most important and should be mitigated, and which of the risks that it's okay to just accept the risk and go with it. But knowing where the risk is in your supply chain and down your supply chain, knowing what the resilience of your supply chain is really important.
Yep. Now, the loss of a critical supplier anywhere in that supply chain can really, really hit you. It can be a showstopper. And widely distributed suppliers are exposed to more and more different hazards than you are in Wyoming. So if you have a supplier in Southern California, earthquake becomes a bigger consideration than it is for you in Wyoming. If you have a supplier in Florida, hurricanes become a consideration for disruptions and resilience, whereas hurricanes are absolutely not something you're going to worry about in Wyoming, I don't think. Now, one of the things that we like to talk about, and I want to introduce this a little bit, I'm a big believer in lean production. I think lean is one of the greatest things to be introduced into manufacturing in the last 100 years. But if you're going to do lean, and I'm sure that the folks at Manufacturing Works emphasize this all the time, if you're going to do lean, you need to do it right. You can't just become so lean that you become anorexic. You can't become so lean that you have no ability whatsoever to flex your operations. And sometimes that happens. And so I'm going to take advantage of where we are in the brief to tell another little story. About 3 years ago, there's a company, Evonik. It's a German company, and they have a plant in southern Germany. That plant manufactures plastic resins. They had a serious fire in the plant. It was so serious there were actually a couple of fatalities. And the plant was projected, the day after the fire, they projected the plant would be offline for 6 months while they recovered production capability. That plant, as I said, produced plastic resins. And the plastic resins were used in automobile interiors, printed circuit boards, and plastic piping. And that plant, that one plant in southern Germany, produced a quarter of the total world supply of that plastic resin. So with all of a sudden, overnight, a quarter of the global supply of that resin goes away. And of course, you know, Toyota and General Motors and General Electric and RCA and Siemens all just said, well, we'll just cut back production by 25% for the next 6 months. Not. These companies scrambled like crazy to find alternate resins to replace that, because there was no slack, no excess capacity at other plants throughout the globe. And now, Evonik managed to bring the plant back on in about 3 or 4 months, but nonetheless, major manufacturers spent millions of dollars scrambling around to replace this commodity coming out of this plant in southern Germany. So a disruption can really upset the biggest companies, not just smaller ones.
Well, and Evonik's also, besides losing revenue for the 3 or 4 months it took them to get back online, you know, some of their customers were fine with the substitutes
Yep.
and didn't go back to Evonik's. So there was other revenue lost. So it's you know, it's really important to, you know, understand the supply chain. And if you're the supplier, it's important to have a plan to remain resilient, to get your, if you have a disruption, to come back online and into full operations as quickly as possible.
And Jennifer, if you'll recall, we talked to the guy at the trade show who said that he was a supplier and his customer had a problem in the plant that forced the customer to outsource some additional work to this supplier to whom we were talking, and he managed to keep that. So he outcompeted his customer and increased his business because his customer had a disruption that forced him to outsource more to this guy. So your ability to recover, your ability to absorb is an important part of this thing, and that's what supply chain risk needs to look at. So we talked about internal business crisis risk, and there's any number of things that people think about, you know, the risk to business as usual, but there's also the potential for a business crisis risk that is outside that business as usual. And that could be gross misjudgment. And I don't mean malfeasance or criminal behavior or anything like that, just bad judgment by senior leadership. Research in Motion, the BlackBerry guys, I think that they probably were guilty at a couple times over the last few years of some pretty gross judgment. They got themselves in a crisis, and it looks like they're probably not going to recover from that. Can't say for sure, but they still look to be in bad trouble. There are so many state and federal regulations now that it's almost impossible not to find yourself in unintentional violation of it. It takes a lot of attention to make sure that you're adhering to all the state and federal regulations and that everything's going smoothly. There's a risk to that. Unwarranted or claims against products. I think everybody probably remembers the issue with the Toyota software and the stuck accelerators and those things. Most of the claims against Toyota nobody was ever able to prove that there were defects in the software. Toyota wound up paying millions of dollars out, but that was a real crisis, and the big impact, even though Toyota paid millions of dollars, the big impact was to their brand, which is really important. So it's important to look at those kinds of things. Warranted issues, product defects and recalls. If you have a risk of or if your quality assurance effort is sliding, there's a risk associated with that. Both of those go to a reputational impairment. There are other things that can hurt your reputation too. Do you have high employee turnover? What does that say about the company? Is there a risk associated with that, and what does it tell you? Or in worst cases, if you have an executive that's indicted for something. And so it probably hasn't been one of those in a couple of weeks, but that's a serious issue that companies need to take into consideration. So one of the last things I think we're going to talk about here is crisis management risk. When a company is in a crisis, facing an emergency, in a crisis, it's important to make decisions and make good decisions. It's so easy because we're human beings to take actions or to make decisions that make things worse or that prolong the crisis. Going back to my story about British Petroleum, they made the crisis there with the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig much worse than it needed to be because of inappropriate comments, inappropriate actions. So it's that kind of thing that can make, it doesn't have to be that big, but it's that kind of an ill-considered action that can make situations worse. And it's important to recognize that there is a risk of having that happen to you because you're not properly prepared.
And the Carnival Cruise Line.
Oh, and Carnival Cruise. I think everybody probably has some vague memory of a couple of years ago. Carnival Cruise went through a situation where the Carnival Cruise seemed to include, 3 days mandatory drifting around the Caribbean without any food or water. But during that time, when they actually had a cruise ship without any power out in the middle of the Caribbean, people holding up "help me" signs on the deck of the ship, and the CEO of Carnival Cruise Lines was on television sitting on a Miami Heat courtside watching a game, laughing and yucking it up with his buds. Now, there's no reason the guy needs to go and not live his life, but at the same time, that's a terrible message to inadvertently send to everybody who might be a Carnival Cruise customer. And so that's a terrible kind of thing, and that was just, they hadn't thought through what the message could be inadvertently sent. And during crisis, you need to not only be able to take the right actions, but you need to be able to react quickly and effectively. The future's coming at you at 1 second per second, even though during a crisis it may seem faster than that. But if you don't act effectively, it's just as bad as not acting with the right decision, and you can increase the damage, you can prolong it.
And this is one of the reasons that we say it's really important to prepare for crisis hitting your company, because the way you handle a crisis could actually be your next crisis. Or if you handle it well, then you recover more quickly.
Okay, so just go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was also going to say that, so these were the risks that we wanted to discuss that you may not have thought about. I don't know if we mentioned, if you do have questions, we're trying to leave some time for questions at the end of this session. So please use the dashboard there to ask questions if you have any.
So in a crisis, time is never your friend. It's particularly not your friend if you're in a crisis or an emergency mode. So how important is it to plan for these risks? Well, we talked about how frequently some of these things pop up in Wyoming, but every year in the U.S. there are 70,000, and I want to add to this, natural disasters. That does not include the internal management errors, the social media problems, the violence issues. It doesn't include any of those. 70,000 disasters occur annually in the U.S. That's about 4 every day in every state. So they're out there, and if we stay in business, eventually we'll experience one or more of those disasters. Now, when those disasters happen and a business closes because of one, the data that we get from the Department of Labor and FEMA says that 2 out of every 5 of those businesses that close their doors because of a disaster never reopen. And of the 3 out of 5 that do, a quarter of them will close within 2 years. And perhaps even more depressing is the fact that of those that reopen and stay in business, 7/8 of them will lose value, 1/5 to 1/3 of the value of the company over the next 5 years because they're busy recovering from and regaining their competitive position, their market position, their customers and their clients. They'll lose that much value over the next 5 years. So closing because there's been a disaster is just a devastating thing. And so planning to respond, and as Jennifer said, to resume operations as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible, is really, really important. And understanding risks is the first part of that. So there are 3 things that Firestorm says are really important, and we've captured them on this slide. Are you at risk of losing your plant, of losing your information, of losing, most importantly, your people? If you're at risk of losing those things, then you need to think about this. And if you think that you're not at risk of losing those things, then you're experiencing something we call disaster denial. Because once again, the business of business is to stay in business. And if you're only planning to stay in business through the end of 2014, well, then it's not a big deal. Okay? But if you're planning on staying in business for the next 50 years or 75 years or 100 years, then it's important because the probabilities simply increase looking out into the future. The probability that you'll experience one of those 70,000 or one of those 2 million workplace violence incidents that's reported every year, those increase year after year after year as you're looking forward. And so it's important to recognize that well, it's not going to happen to us is not a viable strategy. Hope is not a strategy. So what should you do about these kinds of things? Within Firestorm, we like to capture it really crisply, and we like to say that the things that you need to do is predict, understand what are the risks, what are the impacts, and as I said, we'll talk about impacts in a future webinar. But what are the risks, what are the impacts? That helps me understand what I really need to address. As I, smilingly mentioned, Wyoming doesn't need to worry too much about hurricanes. So that's not a high probability, and it's not something you're going to worry about. But there are things that need to be thought about, need to be prioritized, need to be the next step planned for. So what are the policies? What are the processes? What are the procedures? What are the phone numbers? Who do we call? Who do we call if they're not available? Do all those kinds of things, put them together, and make sure that the plans are in place and that they're actionable so that you can perform when the need arises. The way that you make sure that you can perform is by testing the plans and finding out where they break, and then training on those plans. So just like professional sports teams have game plans and they practice to them, it's important to have business continuity plans and to test them and to practice to them so that when the emergency comes up, people have the muscle memory, that's in air quotes there, the muscle memory so that they know how to respond. Jennifer and I talk about the phrase we heard at a conference, going to the basement. So our natural response as human beings is to freeze or flee or fight, and that's called going to the basement because that's right at the base of your brain is what governs that. But it's going to happen. When there's an emergency or crisis, human beings will freeze, flee, or fight. And the only way to get out of that is to know that you have a plan and to execute that plan. Know that you're there, have the plan to get out. Once you have that in place, the next thing that you really want to do is on a regular basis, say annually, which is what we recommend, go back and check it again. Are our risks still the same, or has somebody built a chemical manufacturing plant next to us? Are risks still the same? Are the people still the same? Are the hazards still the same? Are the impacts still the same? If not, make the changes to the policy. Do we still have all the right phone numbers? Do we still have all the right people? We, within Firestorm, had an experience where we went and reviewed a business continuity plan for a client and found out that one of the key people had been dead for several years. So it's really hard to get them on the phone. So we need to make sure that those are updated and current, and then go back, test, and train on those updated plans, and do that on a regular basis so that everyone knows we're good and we're good to go. So now, really quickly, Firestorm, and we're pleased to be working with Manufacturing Works there in Wyoming to help provide resilient solutions. That's what Firestorm is about. We like to say we help companies transform crisis into value. And we work across the country. It's the only thing that we do, but we do everything associated with business continuity, from the predict to the plan to the perform, and across the entire range of all the risks and vulnerabilities that a company can have. We empower people to manage risk, to respond effectively to crisis, and I believe we have one question from Stephanie Meisner. So Stephanie, I think can we unmute her?
No.
Stephanie, I think you're unmuted.
Now am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I sent my question just wanting to know how to educate small businesses to prioritize the planning, because a lot of the issue that we have here, because I'm with the chamber, is that many of the small businesses tend to say, well, you know, I have to get my bookkeeping done and I have to get all these other, you know, daily tasks done, and they prioritize that over these types of planning that's very important for them. So how would you recommend we educate them on prioritizing that?
Okay, Stephanie, I think that's a really good question. And, you know, there is no magic answer to that. There is no you know, tagline that helps do that.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that the risks are real and the impacts are real. And small businesses are much less able to respond to a suspension in operations. The CEO of Coca-Cola said that if every Coca-Cola facility in the world were to disappear overnight, that Coca-Cola could rebuild them just on the strength of their brand. Well, they may be the only company in the world that can do that. Little companies can't do that, and so it's important that, and you're right, they're right, okay, the bookkeeping and the invoicing and all of that is very important because that's business as usual and it has to be done. But we need to sit down, you, me, Manufacturing Works need to sit down and say, okay, what happens if, in fact, you have a fire in your business? What happens if someone drives a car through the front of your business and you're shut down for 3 weeks? What happens? And we need to help them walk through what are the risks and what are the impacts, and it's that risk and impact that helps us to prioritize.
Well, and if I may, Guy, to go back to the question, because I think the crux of this, as you say, is that, you know, they're so busy, you know, wrestling the alligators that they don't have time to drain the swamp. So what's important is to, you know, it's kind of an elephant. To prepare for disaster it's like it's the proverbial eating the elephant, but we need to take it one bite at a time. So our suggestion would be to take it in pieces, like 1 month you sit down and you assess all the risks that you face. You know, the next month take some time, take an hour, take 2 hours in your staff meetings and talk about you know, what the impact of those risks would be on your company if they were to come to pass. And then, you know, then you very slowly start going through all of the other steps of preparing a crisis management plan. You know, how are we going to manage crisis? Who's going to do it? Who's going to respond? Who's going to call who? You know, there are templates available and that type of thing that small business owners can follow if they're just willing to, you know, I know they're putting in 60-hour weeks. It's like if they're willing to put in a 61-hour week and just start thinking about it and, you know, and just start thinking through it. I know it's very difficult because, you know, we understand how hard it is for small business owners to be doing everything themselves. And that's one of the things that we're trying to work with this webinar series that we're doing with Manufacturing Works. We're also going to be starting to do some workshops. So, you know, possibly we can start to help small business owners work their way through this process,
and
as well as the, you know, the larger businesses.
And I think it's important what Jennifer said too. While it would be ideal to be able to snap your fingers and put an entire business continuity plan in place, it's better to do it 1 month at a time and get it done over a period of 12 months or 18 months than it is not to have one.
And if I can jump in, this is Amanda from Manufacturing Works again. The things you're talking about, the very reason why Manufacturing Works is teaming up with Firestorm to bring these webinars and workshops to Wyoming, because the people who I talk with, the manufacturers, the business people, are busy, just like you know, Stephanie. They're trying to make sure their accounts are in order, trying to make sure so many different things are in order. And Manufacturing Works, we're here to try to help make it a little bit easier to take things like disaster planning or even the finances that they're working on in the small steps, break it down, get it done, and provide the assistance to help people be able to step back and take a big picture look at what they're doing and where they're going and make sure they're on track.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay, without any other questions, I'll just put up on the screen here. These are if you have questions and you want to contact us, you can contact Amanda through Manufacturing Works or any of your other Manufacturing Works representatives you may be working with, or you can contact Guy or me at the addresses on the screen. I will mention that our next webinar in November will be on communicable illness and how it can affect your company and how you can plan for communicable illness. And that, Amanda, did you have anything else you wanted to say today?
Just wanted to thank you, Jennifer and Guy, both for doing this webinar. I'm excited. Like I said, the whole purpose of Manufacturing Works here is to help businesses, and I think that you guys being able to do these webinars and later on the workshops is going to be a big help to break it down and make it more manageable to be able to tackle the planning for disasters and be ready.
Great.
So thank you.
Okay, then that concludes. Oh,
just one quick thing. If any of the webinar attendees have any feedback or additional questions, please don't hesitate to feed them in through Amanda. We want to be responsive to your needs and your interests, and we want to help you as much as is possible. So once again, thank you. And we'll give you back 7 minutes of your day.
Concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for attending.